Okay, we have a few people joining, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I am Mark Fowler. I'm the CEO at the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. It is my extreme pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is entitled Leading D&I Culture Change, the Journey Towards Religious Inclusiveness. And we are featuring this afternoon in this session one of the people I am very much a fan of, and his private security has kind of like kept me away. Jörg Schmitz, Managing Director of the Inclusive Leadership Institute. I have to tell you that I am really, really excited that Jörg is continuing his work with us and continuing to delve into this topic. This was something that I've been thinking about for a number of years, and we were finally able to have Jörg join us for our Religious Diversity Leadership Summit earlier this year. And then he agreed to go even deeper into the content that he provided. So today, Jörg is going to build off of that initial presentation, which you can find on our YouTube channel. And there, he really provided an anthropological perspective of religion and culture and how those dynamics play out in organization. And today, we'll delve deeper into examining what it takes to make religious inclusiveness real in our organization. For this conversation, you'll see your talk using some case studies and scenarios to explore some very specific challenges of religious diversity in the workplace, and then examine how teams and leaders and organizations can address these challenges and how the responses may differ based on the stage of a company's maturity with addressing religious diversity. So I want to make sure that you have all of the time that you can with Jörg. So with that, I introduce you to my very dear friend, Jörg Schmidt.
Thank you, Mark. I do need to talk to my security detail, as you said. That's obviously something we want to change. The problem with that security detail is I don't know where they are. So
They're probably doing the best job that they can. So I don't want to throw them under the bus.
yes, exactly.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. And if you joined for the summit session, you'll recall that one of the points I was trying to make is that religion is certainly a human universal, speaking as an anthropologist, and yet it is oftentimes excluded or really minimized in our corporate DE&I discourse. And so this gap is really something that we may need to lead into or want to lead into, hopefully. And this is what this session today is about. I am planning to explore this with you rather than just make it a presentation like the last time, which is why I'm inviting you to log into Menti. You don't have to, obviously, but if you do have a separate device or can do this in a different window, that would be excellent, because that enables us to interact and engage with some of the case material that Mark also mentioned. In order to do that, you can use the QR code, or you can dial into www.menti.com and put the code in that you see on that cover slide, 19573554. You'll see that on each slide as we are progressing as well, and that hopefully helps you to join. And I'll remind those that are joining us a little late as well. So in order to make sure that this works, actually, I wanted to ask you a question as you're dialed in. And the question is, when we are talking about religious inclusiveness, after all, that's how, I titled this session, leading DE&I culture change. And leading the journey towards religious inclusiveness. What does that mean to you? What does it conjure up? And while hopefully you're finding your way into Menti, and again, the instructions are also on top of this slide, and put in some responses here that should show up right away on these slides. I'll tell you a little bit about why I chose this as an entry point. Um, which also has a lot to do. And thank you. The first things are coming in. Thank you for doing this. It tells me also that you're dialed into Minty, so this is great. Um, the, um, the important aspect to any diversity challenge, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusiveness challenge is that all of them require cultural change. So it's not only about the topic itself, whether it is religion or race or gender or LGBTQ plus or any of the other what we call dimensions of diversity. But it's also the art of cultural change that we need to master. And very often I find that DE&I practitioners are not spending perhaps sufficient energies on equipping leaders in the organization to engage in cultural change, which then puts limitations on any of the diversity progress they are seeking to make. And especially when that progress is meant to address intersectional challenges, and certainly religious inclusiveness has a strong intersectional flavor to it when we think about it in the context of other diversity challenges. So anyway, let's look at what you're putting in here. Religious inclusiveness, part of the human experience, and I'm adding a few letters here. Absolutely essential, you know. And because religion is a human universal, it is really a significant omission if we are actually not focusing on religion as part of our DE&I journey, or overall thinking about the culture that we're building, especially when we're trying to enable people to be and bring their true self to into the workplace, which is, of course, one of the ways that we oftentimes talk about building an inclusive workplace. Respect is clearly central here. Understanding, I love that. And I love also the definition of respect when you go back to the origins of it is it actually means to see again, you know, to consider again. So in other words, not to treat superficially, you know. Respect is actually, when we reduce the word respect to its origins, it means we look again, we look a second time. We're not treating somebody superficially, which I think is great when we are thinking about respect. Joy, I love that. Tolerance, safe space for all, intentional challenging. That's maybe a theme we can work with. All beliefs, absolutely. And I think I mentioned this last time, when we think about religion or religious variation and diversity from an anthropological perspective, we need to realize that the focus on belief tends to be a more Western understanding of religious diversity. A more Eastern way of looking at religion, understanding religion, is based in practice, in behavior. And oftentimes in Western discourse on religion, we are extremely concerned with the content, the belief content of a given community or a given religious community or religion. And oftentimes in a more Eastern understanding of religion, it's really about behavioral practices. Love, I love that theme, no pun intended. And of course, joy is coming back, and safe space for all. So let's keep this in the back of our minds as we are exploring this topic deeper, and exploring particularly what it means when we're building religiously inclusive organizations. Before we get into our first case as the jumping off point to thinking about what are stages, what is a maturity model around religious inclusiveness, and what does it look like, I just want to make sure that that I'm cognizant of any particular questions or challenges that you would like to see addressed in our time together. And so I'm looking a little bit for any specifics there. And while you're putting your questions and challenges in. And I hope that we'll able to see a few in a second. Um, I'll tell you um, why I think it's important when we're now thinking about leading DE&I culture change in the towards religious inclusiveness, why a maturity model is so important. Just like other dimensions of diversity, and this entire transformational journey is anchored in the way we lead it. We lead people through and organizations through a maturation. It's actually important to anchor religious inclusiveness specifically in a specific maturation model. So that can help us guide our progress. Um, so let's see what you're putting up here. How do we normalize the work to be done with religious inclusiveness? Well, that's great. It's a great question, actually, and I would say, as a quick response, normalizing it starts with making it central in the way you architect DE&I, and also in the way that you equip leaders to address the diversity that matters to the employees and the team members in their subjective experience. Let me just, how does a space focused on religious inclusion avoid becoming Western or Christian centered? Great question. Let's put that in the back of our discussion as well. People still seeing any discussion of religion as something that should be avoided in the workplace. Keep that thought, because if that's the perception, that might actually indicate a certain stage of maturation in the organization. And then our thinking needs to become, what do I need to do to get the organization into the next space, into the next stage of development? What conversations do I need to have? And it sometimes starts with just very basic conversations about the role of religion in our upbringing in society, and raising some interesting questions. You are right, it is treated often like politics, and that's also a dimension of diversity we may need to tackle overtly in order to actually do justice to the complexity of our world and the complexity of the human experience. And it does take courage of leaders, which is why I believe a lot of these questions really come together in the art and science of inclusive leadership, because courage is a key component of leading inclusively. Why people always mix up religion with politics, and I think this is a great question, actually. And religion and politics, may have a relationship. Of course, the relationship we structure in very specific societal contexts. And in today's polarized environment, both religion and politics serve to polarize or to create either healthy or unhelpful conversations. And I think that's our challenge, right? How do we create inclusive conversations about religion and politics and the intersection between those two? If you think of religion, as we discussed in the summit session, as being socially bounded, a kind of a belief system and a practice system that defines communities, that gives us a sense of social identity, then it makes sense how religion and politics are actually intertwined, because religion as a marker of community also is a political aspect, has probably always been to some degree. How do we explore religious inclusion and intersectionality? With global lenses. That's a very big question. And I just yesterday I've moderated a session on belonging and identity aspects of belonging, and I think religion comes close to that as well. And the solution to the global question maybe is we start a global conversation within the team and the people that we have in our organization. So by opening up the conversation a little bit into how does religion impact with how we all grew up, and making that a point of conversation, that probably helps us open up that kind of conversation and exploring that with each other. Let me just scan some of these other questions. Let's look at this. Religious hatred that happens in and outside of work. How do we, absolutely, that's obviously a very, very current topic. How do we demonstrate religion is not competing priorities with work responsibilities? That is probably something that ties religion to many other DE&I challenges, actually. How do we manage the intersection of company culture with various faith cultures? Great, and this may be, so thank you for sharing these topics. We'll come back to some. I cannot promise to all, but certainly to some. And by the way, I don't want to forget the intersection between religious inclusiveness and LGBTQ plus inclusiveness in the workplace. Sometimes a very difficult conversation to have both, but it is precisely those difficult spaces that leaders need to step into. We need to model respectful conversations about those diversities and their intersections in the workplace in order to understand who we are as individuals more deeply. And that is not easy. It requires courage, as we said. It means also stepping beyond a superficial understanding of any diversity dimension and actually saying, and we need to overtly state this, that diversity creates a sense of tension and unease with certain elements. It creates challenges and dilemmas, and we need to step into those challenges and dilemmas together. Nobody has a singular solution, and it requires a sense of humility as the entry point into this conversation. And so leaders oftentimes need to become good facilitators of a sometimes difficult and contentious dialogue. Perhaps those thoughts are really foundational to inviting you to explore this particular case. And I think this particular case actually hits on a number of these challenges and dilemmas that you articulated. So let's think about this for a moment. I called this, by the way, all cases that I use are steeped in a reality that I have either observed, witnessed, or participated in. So there are real events behind this. So let's fact or faith. That's what I called this essentially. So an external keynote speaker makes a reference to evolution as an obvious fact. This makes some employees very upset as they see their fundamentalist Christian belief invalidated and disrespected. And I should also say, in the current politicized climate, that there is a high level of sensitivity, or there was a high level of sensitivity towards that element, right? So they raise this with management, as they also feel that this violates the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. They demand that the company screens guest speakers better. So this is just think about this for a moment, and let's think about this together. And while you cannot necessarily, I can't invite you to speak to this, I'm going to debrief this scenario a little bit, against a maturity model for religious inclusiveness that I found very recently in some academic literature as well, and because it's one of the few maturity models that I have found that is specifically focused on religious diversity, and even that it is so current and was just released, even is some evidence that this topic is becoming more central, even in the academic discussion and debate around this. But let's think about this for a moment. The reference to evolution as an obvious fact runs counter to a particular belief system, not just, I should say, fundamentalist Christian beliefs, but this happened to be the community that was represented in the audience, and that raised this to management. So think about, what does your company do around these issues? And as I'm now guiding us through this maturity model, we can play out this specific scenario. What would happen in an organization at each of the 4 stages of this maturity model? And the citation you see at the bottom of this screen, by the way, and as a social scientist, I always like to anchor what I say and how we discuss it in some scientific literature, at least social scientific literature. And the model is actually, the Kaizen HC model of religious inclusion. The citation is provided right there. And I see there is some, I can't read it, and I'll ask Cameron in a moment to maybe see if there are questions coming through in the chat, or discussion points to what we're sharing. But think about level 1 in this maturity model is called avoidance. And the organization that is in that stage could be classified as an avoidant organization, which simply means that there is a culturally embedded ignorance and avoidance and averseness to considering, touching, discussing, mentioning religion as a diversity element. So we're just simply avoiding or denying it, which is, in maturity models, usually the first stage anyway. But let's think about this, this particular case around people taking exception to the declaration of evolution as an obvious fact. And in an organization that is in the avoidance stage, what is likely to happen, or what would likely to happen, is nothing. The management would probably, take the opinion in and stay relatively silent on the issue. And thank you. I think you're just providing a link to this particular article. That's very helpful. So what is likely to happen is nothing in the organization. It wouldn't necessarily become acknowledged. There wouldn't necessarily be any policy done. There wouldn't necessarily be a response, maybe a thank you for bringing this to our attention. We will take it under advisement. That's probably as much as we can expect from a level 1 organization around this. And as I'm going through this, think about your own organization, because I'll have a question for you in a moment to ask. When you think about your organization, what level do you believe your organization is at? That's not how all organizations would perhaps approach this. A level 2 organization is essentially coming at this question of religious inclusiveness from a compliance perspective. So they would be considered a compliant organization. They would assume a very strict legal requirement of non-discrimination. And essentially take any measure they would need to take in order to reduce legal exposure or risk. So what would happen if in this scenario is that probably the response might be, thank you for bringing this to our attention, and this would probably immediately be relayed to the legal department. So the legal department would essentially adopt a very risk-oriented way of thinking around matters of diversity, any type of diversity, by the way. So there would be a screening of this as a risk factor. And then based on the legal departments, and not all are the same, obviously, and there are some are more, from a DE&I perspective, perhaps more advanced and progressive than others. But generally, there would be the perspective, what do we need to do to mitigate risk? So in this case, it could actually lead to a policy change. It could lead to a disclaimer that the organization might issue around this keynote speech that might say, in hindsight, issue a statement that the opinions of an external speaker are theirs and not necessarily represent those of the organization, and maybe with a statement of apology to some degree. Usually it's not just we are sorry, but usually some other, we regret, that if some members in the audience were felt it wasn't an appropriate content or so. That would probably be what a compliant organization would do. The next stage, level 3, is classified in this model as an emerging organization. This is an organization that obviously stepped out or beyond a compliance mindset and into an exploratory mindset of religious diversity as a dimension of diversity and inclusion. However, probably not fully mature, because that's where the label of emerging comes from. So the definition here, it may promote religious inclusion internally or express support for it, but not necessarily take an external advocacy stance. And so what this might look like is going beyond a purely compliance and legally oriented statement into actually perhaps using this event, this keynote speech, as an opportunity to demonstrate sensitivity towards religious diversity, and simply use this keynote speech as a way of bringing out and bringing about conversations about religious diversity among their workforce and in the workplace. There is also a sense that in emerging organizations, leader-driven initiatives are oftentimes created. So leaders are oftentimes empowered to address religion and religious inclusiveness, and oftentimes in a way, and this is an unfortunate perhaps a result of this, that it's oftentimes a bit clumsy and biased based on leaders' particular religious stance. And that can create some really unfortunate dynamics inside of companies if it's not addressed and managed well. This is where leaders need a lot of education, and where you want some deliberate attention being placed on this topic. I think this is where emerging organizations need to reach out to Tanenbaum, for example, for some advice and some support here. And this is perhaps where a number of organizations find themselves today. The last stage in this model is called transformational. And these are organizations, as you can guess, that advocate for religious inclusion in the workplace, in their industry, and in wider society. So they cultivate a public voice. They seek holistic approaches to religious inclusion that reconcile some of the tensions that you brought out. All the challenges that you brought out somehow are not just seen, recognized, but they're also addressed in perhaps somewhat better or worse ways. But it's a very active engagement with the tensions and the dynamics around religious identities at work, and creating an inclusive frame for that conversation. And it's so in a way that does not give preference to any single quote unquote preferred religious context. In the session in the summit, we spoke about the religious context of our societies, right? And most social contexts are religiously structured and patterned, even though individuals may not have a religious belief system that they endorse. You can be rather agnostic religiously and still be impacted very much in your thinking by your society around specific religious belief systems. So that is recognized as such. So in other words, you have a more global representation. One example is we're celebrating Diwali right now. And Diwali in many ways, I mean, in a Western context, is not an indigenous religious tradition. It is one that we may celebrate recognizing the global nature of our organizations and of our workforces that do celebrate Diwali and for whom Diwali is actually a very important holiday. So think about how that is being recognized and treated in your organizations today. And interestingly, that third point, because it is a maturity model of religious inclusiveness, that organizations at level 4 actually make religion a core, perhaps top of their ID&E agenda. Or DE&I agenda, whatever sequencing of the letters to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness you prefer, alongside gender and race, recognizing religion as, again, one of those universal human diversity dimensions that we talked about in our summit session. So I hope this makes sense. And before I ask you actually, where would you classify your organization, just out of pure interest, Cameron, are there any specific questions or comments that you would like to highlight at this point?
Thank you, Jörg. I actually don't see anything in the chat or the Q&A right now. I think a lot of the engagement has been in the Menti polling.
Great. So let's take a look at, let's give you that polling opportunity. Thank you, Cameron. And I gave you essentially 5 options here. And, so 4 options are pretty clear. Where do you see your organization? Is it in avoidance, in compliance, in emerging or transformational, but also other? Because while it is, I think, a very interesting maturity model, partially because it is so recent and it is focused on religious inclusiveness, you may actually disagree with the classifications, and you may see other formations, other organizational stages in there. So I wanted to make sure of giving that as an option as well. But it seems to me that at the moment, we have a very interesting convergence here, compliance and emerging as the predominant forms. What I find interesting is that you're not classifying any organization into avoidant. And that I find interesting. In my experience, I would say I'm certainly have come in touch with a number of organizations that I would classify as avoidant. It's very rare to come in touch with a truly transformational organization in this space. And so I'm not surprised by that at all. So we see a little bit of a shifting in a 40 to 60% emerging. And I'm curious, as we are evolving this thinking, how your organizational stage, what data you are using to essentially say, oop, this is where our organization is, or my organization is. And please share some of that in the chat. And Cameron, please feel free to alert us to something that comes through. If there are any questions or examples that come out.
Yeah, I see one question here in the chat, Jörg. I can read this out here. It says, for an organization that is in the early stages of the religion model, they may also be green with respect to other DEI efforts. With limited resources, religion might take a backseat to other DEI topics. What do you say to organizations that take this approach?
Well, the resource issue is a big one, right? I mean, and I think it's sometimes even an indication of how well a DE&I function is resourced, is also an indication of how these topics are prioritized, as well as how the reporting lines of a DE&I function, right? So all of these tell you something about the mindset or the prevailing culture around DE&I. And I think it's an absolutely true observation. An avoidant organization around religion probably is avoidant around other diversity dimensions as well. Although I have to say, it is very perplexing to me how many organizations are actually reluctant to address specifically religion and politics at the same time, for probably that intertwined perception of the two topics. I mean, I know many organizations I would classify as rather progressive on things like gender or LGBTQ plus, or other diversity dimensions, that are actually extremely reluctant to touch religion because of the association with politics. And a lot of leaders have a lot of work to do, I think, in this space. Some organizations I know where leaders are deeply afraid because they see DE&I as a political agenda, and therefore are really reluctant to actually fund or resource DE&I function beyond a rather superficial level, because they're afraid of just that DE&I itself polarizes the organization, and this is a very unfortunate association oftentimes. I don't know, Cameron, if that addresses the question very much. Let me just look at that again. But what else are you seeing?
So we do have a comment that came into the Q&A section that I think is worth highlighting. Someone said, I was pleasantly surprised at how the US military embraced religious diversity easily 20 years ago. Chaplains are in place to support and represent all religions and needed to accommodate and celebrate this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like I said, it's core to our social selves, our identities. It's a human universal. It's a cultural universal. So, excluding it from any discussion of our social identities and our experiences, and also the motivation for our work, it is a real miss. It's a real blind spot. So any organization should be commended to addressing it. And you're right. I mean, the military and other governmental organizations probably have done that earlier than most. So that's absolutely true.
We have another question that came in. Someone asked, if we're a brand new company with just a team of 5, what is the very first tiny step we can take to get us on the right track?
Well, I mean, I'm a big fan, and by the way, this may address the part of the first question as well. I'm a big fan of embracing the interdimensional, or intersectional aspects of our identities. If we are talking about questions of diversity, never come in a singular dimension. They're always packaged in people, and people are complicated and complex with interesting social histories. And it is when we open up, when we build a culture of respect for our complicated social histories, recognizing that we don't fit boxes all that easily and neatly, and that we need to contextualize the DE&I conversations with our own individual stories. And in fact, in our own, that's the whole idea of building inclusive organizations, that we feel we fit into that fabric that the organization is creating, that we belong into this diverse tapestry, and that the organization recognizes the complexity, the nuance, intersectionality. It doesn't require a lot of resources to build a DE&I strategy and communication on that principle and that premise. And that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily look at the understand the deeper elements of any singular diversity dimension, but that we use it as a gateway into understanding ourselves and understanding other people. And that's what we can do. As if it's a team of 5, that's where we should start with. In fact, it's great if you have a small team, a small company, and you're able to start building the fabric, the diversity and inclusiveness culture of among those 5 people, because it is when the company grows around those 5 people that these principles will become replicated, and build the fabric of the company. I've seen too many organizations that have forgotten that they were once small, and that the structures among the founders and the founding members of that culture create the reality of the culture that then others are onboarded into. And if we don't model it in that core group early, it probably won't happen anyway, especially not when the company grows rapidly. So let's work with those thoughts a little more. And I wonder, this is an example that I find very interesting because it intersects, with a number of different diversity dimensions as well. So you may read this real briefly. And Cameron, we can open it to some more questions after this case. And I want to offer a couple of more thoughts about what we need to think about when we're building cultures that progress us on this dimension. So think about this. I mean, this is on the face of it an issue around hairstyle, and and external appearance, and we're all familiar with these kind of things in our workplaces. But when that appearance and the stereotypes and perceptions of that appearance intersect with racial categories, when they intersect with religious categories, as in this case, we get a very, very complicated mix, actually, that is not so easy to contemplate. And again, think about how your organization would reconcile standards of professionalism that have this multi-layered element here. And we can debrief this particular case from a number of different lenses, and applying a number of different lenses. I think if you're adding that religious lens to it, it becomes a really interesting conversation. What we do need to do, and I just want to guide us through this real briefly, is to recognize a couple of things. That culture is what is expected, modeled, reinforced, and rewarded by and within a particular group. So that small group of 5 is building the culture of the organization through looking at the interactions, the patterns among those 5. And to me, it's very practical, actually, this definition, because we can actually go to a group, leaders in an organization, and simply ask, what is expected, modeled, reinforced, and rewarded around here? And what is expected, modeled, reinforced, and rewarded around religion around here? And then we need to think about what we formally say and claim, the statements we have, the things we put on our website. We believe in inclusiveness and diversity and whatnot. And then what is happening informally? What do people actually do, and what do we say? So we might say, to this earlier case around Akim, that obviously we don't discriminate, and it's perfectly fine, and we support diversity, and we do in all forms and so forth, and which means that hairstyle and dreadlocks and so forth doesn't matter. But we may have managers locally who make very different decisions based on other criteria, namely, their standards of professionalism, their subjective biases, what customers might be saying or not saying or demanding of them. And what defines cultures is what guidance do we give our leaders and managers in straddling the inevitable gap between those two dimensions of formal and informal culture. I call these the say-do gaps that exist in any organization. And so we need to actively put guidelines in place to navigating the inevitable dilemmas and critical incidents, of which obviously the Hakim example was one. So if I as a local manager don't have guidelines or principles that help me actually reconcile the say-do gaps that sit between our intention to be inclusive, religiously inclusive, and the actuality, what people are imagining, what they're thinking, their biases, the situational stresses and strains that really define how people make decisions locally. If we don't have guiding principles and equip people with ways in which to reconcile these tensions, we are not developing our culture further. And in other words, a big recommendation here is to talk about cases, specific incidents that put us in touch with these say-do gaps and the dilemmas that we need to navigate, and figure out together, have open conversations about this. And I love case study methodology. So I shared with you two so far that I frequently use in order just to bring about these conversations. But the conversation is, these are just conversation starters. And then we need to take the conversation further into saying, how do we want to operate? What do we want to do? What does this mean for us here? And when we ask this question in that way, what do we want to be? How do we want our managers to act? Who do we want to be? And we engage people in an inclusive dialogue around answering that question, the question of developing an inclusive culture becomes a formation of our organizational identity. So leaders oftentimes feel they need to have the solutions or the answers, when actually what they ought to do is facilitate an inclusive process for wrestling with the inevitable dilemmas between politics and religion and all the other things that you mentioned early. Let's make them open explorations in our organizations. Let's equip leaders with the skill and the courage to not be fearful of opening these conversations, and tap the wisdom of collective thinking, all in service of figuring out who do we want to be around these challenges. And when you empower a group of people around this, very interesting and very constructive and positive things can happen. But when we act out of fear, out of a sense of risk, usually not many good things come from that in any dimension of diversity. So I had a couple of other scenarios. One is this one, for example, which is very timely as well. I leave this up, but Cameron, what questions are coming through, or what observations are coming through?
Yeah, I see a comment here that says this scenario also brings up the concept of who defines professionalism, and what
Yes.
culture or cultures or country or countries have had a role in furthering that definition. It may not likely be an issue in other cultural contexts.
Absolutely. And it may not be an issue in other, and this is where we need to have find the right scenarios and have the right conversations that are relevant to our social context. But again, we all operate with certain norms, right? And this is where sometimes we assume that the ideal space of DE&I is in some sort of an unbiased space, or we are working towards some space of absolute neutrality that probably is an illusion. I'm speaking as an anthropologist now. We probably will not be able to attain this state of pure neutrality or bias reduction. To me, the act of leading this journey is actually like a continuous improvement journey. We are likely by finding and eliminating some biases, we are likely to create new ones or other ones that we will create and recreate. So we need to continuously monitor ourselves and ask the same questions repeatedly.
Thank you, Jörg. I actually do see a question that came in at the tail end of the last section, but I think it might kind of hook on nicely to what you've just been speaking about. This question reads, I'm assuming that like other maturity models, it's not always a steep climb upward. And when new initiatives are implemented, that new activity may take a company back to the avoidance level. Can you speak a little about the flexibility within the stages themselves?
Yeah. By the way, I'm just flipping to another example because to me, this is a methodology here. You know, by working through these particular cases with our people and asking questions, how do these things happen here? How does this apply where we're actually building this? No maturity model is pure. You know, I mean, the models are always pure. The reality is always messy, right? And what I am most interested in, from my perspective, is actually what does the change journey look like? And it's a messy journey. It's not a linear journey. We need to, this is why I default to this notion of, as leaders, we need to facilitate our people through a nonlinear journey. And that means that we need to create spaces for dialogue. We need to create spaces for exploration. We need to create spaces that engage us with this messy reality. So, you know, for example, in this maturity model, getting from a compliance mindset to an emerging mindset is actually not a linear process, but it requires you know, leaders to challenge the legal department, for example, challenge each other and themselves to engage in these ways. So there is a question coming up. I perceive that we're speaking today from our US perspective. For global companies, local cultures and laws add difficulty. Absolutely, they add. And it's legally restricted to discuss religion at work. Absolutely. But what it's not, what French law, and this is where we sometimes need to step out of a legally framed space for conversation. What the legal environment in France does not inhibit us is from exploring, let's say, different sources that have impacted us in our upbringing, in our own sense of identity, and what's important, that shaped our value systems. So we can discuss the impact and the role that religion has played in on our social formation, in our organizations, without making the discussion about religion. And you know, just how I think we are speaking to some degree to a US perspective or a Western perspective, although France, you know, is certainly Western. What we also have to keep in mind that even the way we address religious diversity is subject to diversity. You know, in a global context, and for me, the starting point is not religion. It's not any diversity dimension. It's actually bringing it back to what has shaped you, what has shaped me, what is my relationship to the things that have shaped you, or what is your relationship to the things that have shaped me, and how do these things manifest in our current thinking and value system. That's also where we build bridges, and I think that's where a legal framework doesn't necessarily help.
And I see we have one more question here. This one says, I think there's another part of this conversation, the role of the organization to protect their employees. For example, I worked in a large global company and decisions were made around certain assignments that certain employees could or could not take. Most were associated with religion. The discussion took place with employees to ensure career development was always in place. I considered this a pretty mature organization when it comes to religion. It was around the safety of employees.
I mean, that depend. Of course, I mean, it depends on. But even that, that requires. So even in a decision like this, um, there are some pitfalls around biases that we are making. We're protecting employees, yes, but we need to be careful that we don't um, wrap, make the concern for the safety of employees a reason to nurture and reinforce biases that may or may not be true, actually. And so I don't know the specific context. There are certainly contexts where we need to protect employees and the protection of employees should be our first priority anyway. But the connection to religion may not be that direct. And sometimes it is not religion that creates the risk or so. It's actually other, environmental or social elements. So, for example, there may be a socioeconomic stratification issue. There may be other issues that intersect with religion. So sometimes we need to take it apart and make sure that we don't inadvertently burden the idea of religion too much with the risk factors we perceive. However, that said, it really depends on the circumstances, the geography, the environments we're talking about. I think, though, that in any case, even that question opens up to a tremendous dialogue, learning, and exploration.
Just giving it a second to see if there are any last questions or comments coming through. I see someone said they have to jump. I do want to recognize that it's a little after 1 now. But yeah, I think I just give the floor to you again, Jörg, to see if you have any closing thoughts or comments.
Yeah, I hope this was a useful extension of what we started at the summit. It's not exhaustive, and it's not conclusive in any way. But what it's trying to say is that if we want to advance our organizations along this journey of religious inclusiveness, it needs to start with dialogue and exploration and a certain degree, certain fearlessness in addressing topics that are so essential to our shared humanity. Just how it takes courage to address race, just how it takes courage to address gender, and how any of these topics can be risky depending on the social context. Religion is no different necessarily, and political diversity is no different either. And as leaders, fortunately or unfortunately, it behooves us, or is increasingly part of our challenge, to guide our employees and organizations through the maturity that is required to acknowledge and the three-dimensional reality of our human experience. And I think that's so I end with a very anthropological thought as well. And thank you for spending those extra minutes.
I think that's the perfect way to wrap things up. So just thank you so much, Jörg, as always. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend and for all of your engagement. As a reminder, we will have this recording posted online shortly. So we'll share that out via another email so that you can refer back to the session and that, so you can share it with anyone that wasn't able to attend. We'll also include a link there to Jörg's previous session from our 2022 Religious Diversity Leadership Summit. In combination, I think those are going to be great resources moving forward. And if anyone does have any questions or follow-up items, please feel free to reach out to someone from the workplace team, and we'd be glad to continue the conversations or to connect you to Jörg. But again, on behalf of Tanenbaum, we want to thank you, Jörg, for your time today and for your continued partnership. And we're looking forward to our next engagement.
Thank you.